Orcs Don't Babysit, Part 1, by Tony Edwell. Crald was having the nicest dream. He was back in Booty Bay, lying on the sun-warm planks just outside his family's home. The breeze off the water was cool, and the bustle of the docks created a relaxing drone. A shadow passed over him and he frowned. His mind became aware enough to sense a presence hovering over him, and he struggled to move in both the dream and in real life. He cracked open his eyes, and another, bright blue pair stared down at him. "You're finally awake," Fixza said with a cheer, throwing her hands into the air. Crald, on the other hand, was still recovering from the knee-jerk reaction to punch what his mind had perceived as a threat. What remained of his hair was already gray, but he swore she was doing her best to make it go white. "Fixza," he said, his voice low with a thread of tension as he remained lying down to calm his heartbeat. "How many times have I asked you not to come into my room unannounced?" "But you were sleeping," she pointed out. "How was I supposed to ask if you're asleep?" He sat up and swung his legs over the side of the bed. As he put his elbows on his knees, he gave her the look such a response deserved. Hers was only mildly sheepish in return. "You wait until I'm awake," he pointed out. Her lower lip trembled before she practically exploded with, "But you were taking so long to wake up." She'd thrown her hands up, and now they were held out in front of her, as though pleading for him to understand. At this, he took a long look at her. Her candy pink hair was more erratic than usual, and her eyes were shining with something more than her vibrant personality, coupled with dark smudges beneath them. Her blue overalls were only buckled on one side, and the yellow shirt beneath it was already sweaty. "Is the wagon loaded?" "Yep," she said, nodding rapidly. "The robots hitched?" "Yes," she said, her excitement building. "And was it all finished before dawn?" "Yay, hey." Crald shook his head. "You didn't sleep." "I did," she said defensively. "More than a couple of hours?" She couldn't meet his eyes as she mumbled. He didn't need to hear her response to know the truth, and he sighed again. "Let me get dressed so we can go there and get back. That way I can put you to bed before you collapse." She jumped with a whoop and dashed from his hut. He laid back on his bed for a moment to soak in the last warmth of the blankets and mentally prepare himself for their trip to Camp Mojache. When Crald ended up staying in Fairless longer than intended, the two of them and the robots built him a hut and some furniture. It was lopsided but functional, kind of like the two of them. However, he still needed some household goods they couldn't make with the supplies they had, so he'd headed to nearby Camp Mojache. On the first trip, he'd gone alone, wanting to make sure it was okay with the Tauren there for Fixza to visit as well, because she'd asked. They'd given their consent, and the following trip he brought her along. Unfortunately, the robots came too. This time around there were rules. No robots, and she couldn't leave Crald's sight. It could have been worse. They could have banned her, or made us pay in gold for everything, he muttered out loud. Then he thought for a moment about the Mojache warriors' weapons. It could have been a lot worse. As it was a good thing Fixza had gotten overzealous with the planting. They had more than enough to compensate the Tauren for the damages and keep themselves in food for the winter. Not that Fairless experienced winter much, but old habits died hard. Sighing, he sat back up to get dressed. He pulled on a pair of canvas shorts, since he'd be walking the road and not moving through the brush. The sandals he slipped on had seen better days, but so had his body. It was littered with various, pale green scars, while every joint ached if he didn't stretch upon waking and before sleep. The braids of his beard were still in good shape, so he left them be. The last thing he did was arm himself by strapping his sword in its scabbard to his waist. When he finally made his way out of the hut, he saw Fixza dancing in place next to the wagon, as she hummed a tune and fiddled with a strap. She spun at his approach, clearly jumpy from lack of sleep, but he refrained from shaking his head at her. "Let me check the wagon, then we'll head out," he said. She jumped up onto the seat at the front with an excited squeak, and picked up the controller to the robots clamped onto the yokes. "Ready when you are." Crald checked all the baskets in the back, but he should have known what to expect. Fixza was the definition of organized chaos, in that she was meticulously organized but created chaos everywhere she went. All the baskets of potatoes, tomatoes, beans, strawberries, and peppers were in neat rows, with the heaviest baskets positioned right behind their seats. The canvas was mostly strapped down already, while the rest was folded back awaiting his inspection. "Looks great," he said, and finished securing the canvas before heading to the front and climbing up onto the seat next to her. "Thanks," she said, beaming with pride. With that, they set off and fell into the comfortable routine of her chatting away while he interjected grunts and other encouraging noises where appropriate. As they made the final approach down the hill to Camp Mojache, the conversation trailed off as she bounced in her seat in anticipation. Crald halted the wagon when the guards held out their hands for him to stop, and climbed down to untie the canvas so they could inspect everything. "Looks good. I'm sure the chief will appreciate it. Leave the robots a ways back, then you're good to head in," one of them said, sounding almost relieved. It was an odd comment, since Crald was sure Chief Spirithorn would appreciate never seeing either of them again. However, he didn't have long to think about it, since the other guard was coming over with a kodo to pull the cart. Fixza used her remote to command the robots up the road and shut them down. There was just enough room on the road for all the maneuvering, and once the kodo was in place, the two of them set off. The last time he'd had Fixza with him, they'd garnered polite looks from the Tauren, and he thought for sure this time they'd get the cold shoulder due to the explosion from the robot. However, that didn't seem to be the case. The Tauren were gathered in twos and threes, having discussions in low tones, and when they noticed the wagon, there were expressions of relief like with the guard. "Are they okay?" she whispered to him. When he looked down at her, her brows were knotted as she scanned the area. "So, she noticed too," he thought as his gaze moved back up to the villagers. "I'm not sure, but we'll ask the chief about it. I hope it's nothing bad. I like visiting here, and they're nice. I don't want anything to happen to them," she said, in a pleading tone. "If something is going on, we'll see if there's anything we can do to help," he promised. "Yes," she agreed, and continued to cast worried looks around the camp. By the time they were over the bridge and at the main pavilion, they'd gathered a procession behind them. Crald had a feeling that whatever was wrong concerned food, and it was confirmed when Chief Spirithorn came out as Crald brought the kodo to a halt. "Give them room," he called out to the crowd. "Everyone will get their share once it's offloaded and portioned." The chief was older, his fur white and mane a dark gray, but his blue eyes were still bright and held an expression of relief. There was a shuffling of hooves, and an angry snort here and there as Tauren bumped into each other. Haddoken and Werb will offload it inside the pavilion to Shindra and Lorana, and they'll portion everything out. Everyone else make a line, and once they're finished, you can come in for your share, he said, and the Tauren around him set about their assigned tasks. The chief came over to Crald and Fixza. "I never thought I'd say this, but the two of you are a sight for sore eyes, and we never thought to hear it," Crald acknowledged. "What's happened? Can we help?" Fixza asked, the questions bursting from her. The chief lifted an eyebrow and looked back at Crald. Crald shrugged. "We want to help if we can. Honestly, this is probably the best thing you could do. Our supply line is being attacked by Grim Totem. We don't know why they've started now, but who knows with them. With the addition of the refugees from Free Wind Post who decided to settle here, we're stretched thin." "I see," Crald said, his mouth set in a thin line. "We haven't gotten through all the harvest, so we'll have another ready to go soon. Thank the Earth Mother," the chief said with a sigh. "Hopefully our warriors will have the situation handled before then." Agreed. The offload didn't take long. There was only one wagon, and with a camp full of hungry Tauren, Haddoken and Werb moved with a purpose. When the last basket cleared the wagon, the chief walked over and clasped for arms with Crald. "Thank you, friend. I'd walk you out, but I need to keep an eye on things here. Hungry people can't think well, and I don't need bloodshed over a potato." He tried to say it with a lightness in his tone, but the tenseness in his shoulders told a different story. "We understand," Crald said, and turned to Fixza. "Let's go." Before she got in the wagon, she walked over to the chief and held out her hand. The chief considered her for a moment, and carefully clasped her arm as he had for Crald. "We'll be back with more food. We promise," she said. Some of the tension eased from his posture, and he smiled. "We appreciate that, friend." She beamed at him and turned to hop into her seat. "I'll see them out," one of the guards from the entrance said, and took the kodo by the bridle. Chief Spirithorn nodded, but his eyes were already distant, his thoughts turning inward as he headed to the pavilion. "Ready?" the guard asked, from the rings on his pale horns that curled close to his head. He was older, but not quite as old as Crald. The fur along the backs of his arms and the top of his head and mane was black, while the rest was an auburn brown. Yes, Crald said. The guard nodded and gave a short whistle to the kodo as he tugged on its bridle. The animal lowed, then started forward. It wasn't a big camp, so it didn't take them long to get to the exit. They passed the gate, and the guard got them as close to the robots as he could without making it too difficult for everyone to maneuver. Crald moved to help him disconnect the kodo, but froze as the guard spoke. "We greatly appreciate the food," he said, not looking up at Crald. By the way he said it, Crald sensed he wanted to say more, but the warrior grit his teeth as he finally looked up. "If you happen to get any extra meat on a hunt, we'd appreciate that too." The words were clearly bitter on his tongue, and he looked away once more as he continued. "If the grim totem weren't enough, the gnolls are sending raids, making it difficult to go on hunts and gathers." "What's your name?" "Droth," he said as he turned the kodo back toward the camp. "Well, Droth, I'd planned on going hunting sometime in the next couple of days. If I get anything extra, I'll dress it and bring it over." "Thank you," Droth said with a dip of his head, appearing even unhappier. "You know, I've been trying to build a chicken coop," Crald began as he climbed down from the wagon. "And while I've gotten better at garden beds, coops seem to be outside of my ability. You have anyone around that could help us with that?" Droth considered him for a second before nodding. "Faye's parents kept chickens, so I'm sure she could help, and I'll come along. You never know how many tasks you have until you get an extra pair of hands." "Sounds like a plan." Crald held out his hand as he'd done with the chief, and the two clasped forearms. Droth led the kodo away, while Fixza went about getting the robot started and in position. They headed off with a wave back at the guards, and the whirring of the robots mixed with the natural ambience of the forest and creaking of the wagon. When they were out of earshot of the guards, Fixza spoke up. "I didn't know you were trying to build a chicken coop." "I'm not." She let out a sputter of surprised laughter. "Then why did you tell him you were?" "Because he needed something to do in return for the meat. That way he doesn't feel like he owes us any favors." She pondered this for a moment and frowned. "But we're happy to help." "You even said so." "We are," he agreed, "and I'd be more than willing to just give them the meat. However, that wouldn't sit right with him when it's asking for more than what we owe as part of our debt. So I offered something they could do in return. I guess," she said, unsure. "Wah, look out." She slammed her hand down on the big red button on the controller. The robots immediately froze, which made the wagon collide into the back of them with a painful jolt. Just before they would have run into an ogre that stumbled out of a nearby bush. He was the typical, ugly ogre with a single eye full of malice, and a perpetual snarl only their mother could love. It was slightly smaller than others he'd encountered, but a small ogre was still a big enemy. It instantly swung a crude wooden club down on one of the robots, smashing it to pieces. "Hey!" Fixza shouted in disbelief. Crald jumped down from the wagon and pulled his sword from the scabbard at his hip. Fear flashed through the ogre's eye, but instead of fleeing it took a step forward and snarled harder. Crald roared back and charged. That did the trick. It shouted something unintelligible as it stumbled backward and fell on its butt, dropping its club and a sack in the process. It didn't stay down for long, and scrambled to its feet, grabbing at the sack while it did so, and clutching it to its chest. It turned and crashed into the brush further up the road, heading northeast. Crald had never seen an ogre beat tracks that fast, but he didn't pursue it. If it continued on its path, it'd miss their place by a wide margin. Once he was sure it was gone, he turned to Fixza. She was looking at the busted robot, her back to him. "Are you okay?" he asked, walking over to her. "I'm sorry about your robot," he said, doing his best to sound sincere. Truth was, he held his breath each time she started them up, because the incident in Camp Mojache was rare, but not an isolated one. "Don't worry about the robot. Look at this," she said excitedly. The first part made him stumble. He didn't think anything short of a Titan visiting them would make her say such a thing. So when he looked around her and saw an egg on the ground, he was even more stumped. "It's an egg," he said flatly. "Yes, but have you ever seen an egg like this?" she asked as she moved around it to get a look from all angles. "No," he admitted. It was the size of a small melon and pale greenish yellow in color, with brighter yellow spots all over. "We have to take it home," she exclaimed, and very carefully lifted it to cradle it in her arms. "To eat?" he asked. She could not have looked more horrified than if he'd torn down her shop in front of her. "No," she said, and turned her shoulder to protect it from him. "We're going to hatch it and take care of whatever is inside." He gave her a dubious look. "You don't even know if it'll hatch, or what's inside. What if it's a devilsaur?" She lifted her chin and scowled at him. "Devilsaur eggs are bigger. You know that. We have to try. Anyways, we can't leave it here for that mean ogre. If it can do that to my robot, it would smash this poor baby to bits." He could recognize the stubborn set to her jaw a mile away, so he sighed. "Fine, but first we have to get home. Let's get this scrap cleaned up, and I'll help with the wagon." The fact she didn't react to him calling the shattered robot scrap and just said, "Okay," was a bad sign for him. She climbed back into the wagon seat, pulling the folded canvas from the back. She used it to make a nest for the egg on the floorboard, and the egg was comically small amongst the crumpled fabric. He shook his head but didn't comment, just went about cleaning up the busted robot and throwing the larger parts into the back of the wagon. Once the egg was settled, she joined him by picking up the smaller parts that could still be used and brushing the unsalvageable ones off the road. Once they were done, she scrambled back up into the seat to check on the egg, talking about her plans for it as she did so. "I'll make a heat lamp and a cozy nest, and you'll hatch in no time." Finally, she left the egg alone and picked up the remote. When she looked at him, her eyes were practically sparkling with joy about their situation. "Ready?" He grabbed the yoke next to the remaining robot. "Ready." Thankfully, home wasn't far, but pushing the wagon wasn't going to be the exhausting part of the rest of his day. That was reserved for trying to get his overexcited, sleep-deprived friend to take a nap, when he knew all she'd want to do is stare at the egg that probably wouldn't hatch. With that joyful thought, he grimaced and pushed.
Hey everyone, Dragons After Dark here, and I just want to say thank you for listening to my story. This was meant to be in the second volume of Orc Tales, but the project never quite got off the ground. It's been finished and gathering dust for a couple of years now, so I figured I'd make this my Orctober entry for the year. I'll have the other parts out in the next couple weeks, and I hope you enjoyed those too. A Camp Mojache, friends!